Hi, I'm Peter from Coffee Parts, and today I'm here with Paul Asquith looking at water filtration. What is it? How does it affect your espresso and your coffee machine? Paul, thank you for coming back.
It's great to be back.
The last video we did with you on pressure profiling was awesome. I learned so much. And I thought I'd bring you back to look at water and how that affects the coffee machine. But more importantly, for those that don't know you, you've been in coffee for a very long time, in a lot of areas of coffee. Do you want to just give it a quick 30-second bio?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I started in coffee as a barista, like everyone seems to start. You know, most people start as a barista at some stage. But for the most part of my career, I've been a coffee trainer for Glory Jeans, for Grinders, for Honor Coffee, for 7 Miles Coffee Roasters, and also a little bit of a stint at Josie Coffee up in Newcastle. Yep. But you know, in my time, I've also competed, judged, won a 2012 Danes Australasian Grand Barista Championship. And I've just focused on making good coffee all the time.
So you sort of know what you're talking about.
A little bit, hopefully.
So bringing it down to water, I feel like this is a common question we get all the time, especially with cafes, the roasters tend to be looking after it a fair bit. But more and more with homes getting really high-end espresso machines, they don't understand how that water affects the machine, and two, how it affects the espresso. So do you want to give a bit of a rundown on why water filtration in espresso is needed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, the biggest thing with home machines these days is that, as you say, that progression of technology.
Yeah.
We're starting to see more and more of that commercial technology work its way into the home, and that means more stainless steel parts, more things that are potentially corrosive and potential problems for your machine in the future. So filtration really plays a massive role in keeping your coffee machine humming along as well as it possibly could be without expensive repair bills. Now the biggest thing for filtration is to balance the water so that you don't get scale, so you don't get corrosion. And that's called the LSI, or the Langlia Saturation Index. So that is a little bit confusing, a little bit high technology, but it basically means you want to balance what's called chlorides in the water, and that's a naturally occurring thing in Australian water, against the carbonate hardness in the water. Okay. If you've got too many chlorides in the water, you're going to get corrosion in your machine. If you've got too many carbonate hardness, too much carbonate hardness in the water, you're going to end up with scale. So the basic balancing is around about 1 part chlorides to 2 parts carbonate hardness, and you should have a machine that doesn't build scale or corrode.
When it comes to scale, water really is different state to state if we're talking about Australia. And what we see here in Sydney is very different to Perth. And when it comes to scale or hardness, not only does it block up the machine quite quickly, if not controlled, but it also affects the coffee. Like, you probably know a lot better than me, but I've always found the higher the scale, the more chalky the coffee is. And the lower it is, if it's just under 100, call it 50, the coffee has no body, and the machine, from an electrical standpoint, the sensors start not picking up, etc. So there is a sweet spot to be in, not only from a machine side, but from a coffee side. But that's the very elementary version of it.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, what you're talking to is the TDS, and so general TDS of around about 90 to 110 parts per million is a really safe place to be for really great tasting coffee. That said, around the country, you're not going to be able to just nail that number straight away. In Melbourne's very soft water, generally right down around the 50s and the 60 TDS. But if you move around the country up to Brisbane, you get a higher TDS, and as you go further west to Adelaide and Perth, you're getting much higher TDS. So the approach is going to be different in every state and every part of the country that you go.
And that's one thing that's sometimes hard for people to understand is it's not what filter for my machine, it really is what filter for the water that you have. And different waters will require, and different outcomes will require different filters. We're talking about coffee specifically, but if it was an ice machine, it's very different to a coffee machine, because hot versus cold have different issues, and then drinking water is a little bit different again, because you don't have to worry about the scale side of things as much.
Yeah, absolutely.
But so what are the three main things in water that people have to kind of know or look at?
Yeah, so I mean the biggest thing is making sure there's no sediments in the water. So you're going to have some form of filtration, generally a carbon block that removes any impurities, anything that's floating around in the water, and that is bigger sediments, maybe down to kind of 5 micron or even sub-micron level, making sure there's nothing floating around in the water. Now that's part of what builds some of the TDS in the water, but the biggest thing that TDS is built on is the carbonate hardness. So that comes in a different form. Carbonate hardness comes from bicarbonates in the water or magnesium in the water, and those things are going to be the things that create flavour, but they're also going to be the things that form scale. So the biggest one is that carbonate hardness, that if there is too much carbonate hardness, you're going to get really high extraction. And as you say, that's chalky, over extracted sort of flavors. And if that's not high enough, then you're going to start to want for more. You're not going to be extracting that coffee as well as you possibly could. So, you know, in some states like Sydney, it's perfect. In other states, you may have to work at building that carbonate hardness a little bit into the water with a certain type of filtration.
Mineralization and stuff.
And then in other states like WA, you may even turn to reverse osmosis, which historically is probably not something that people look at in a home setting. But again, as we progress in the technology of machines in our homes, we're going to have to start to look at better filtration to protect that investment.
With reverse osmosis for coffee specifically, it normally needs to be a blendable unit. There is reverse osmosis that basically strips the water to bare, and then you don't have the minerals in there for things to register from a coffee, from a machine side, and from a coffee side to bring that body in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you can, with the reverse osmosis, you're stripping everything out of the water, bringing it down to a very low TDS. You put that into the coffee machine is just going to sit there and do nothing. So as you say, it's not going to heat because it's not going to have anything to create that water connectivity. So we're going to have to look at remineralizing the water, and there are a couple of ways. There are cartridges you can put on to build the water a little bit. There are definitely RO systems out there that you can actually blend with some of that carbonate hardness and also some of the water that's coming directly from the tap in, just to build it to a safe but high enough level to create that nice water for coffee, basically.
Another thing is the pH of water. And how does that affect coffee?
Yeah, so I mean, the pH in Australia is very fairly level. It's kind of neutral, but if for whatever reason you're using the wrong filtration and it becomes acidic, then you're not going to have that extraction. Again, it's a sort of, it's a sliding scale like the carbonate hardness. If your pH is too low, you're not going to get great extractions. You're going to end up with relatively acidic coffee. And it's, you know, if you go over, now well over, you know, 7.4, 7.5 and start to get up into the 8s of pH, then you start to get that soapiness. You start to lose that clarity of the acidity, and you start to get more of that extraction. You're also probably going to see some slightly syrupy looking espresso shots, but not necessarily in a good way.
I was thinking that. So looking at those three things, TDS, pH and carbonate hardness, that sort of builds the water to a certain degree. There is more, but they're the three common things.
Absolutely.
Then we can look at the technologies of what's available from a filter perspective to control those three things. One thing to note, we're talking about 5 micron earlier, or sub-micron. Coffee machines at the group head have an injector, generally 0.8 mil, sometimes in some Lamazook is 0.6 mil, can be up to a mil on some machines. And if you have water that, especially we find in areas that have a lot of construction going on, you tend to get particles that are a bit bigger, or you can't see it visually, but they're a bit bigger and they can block that injector. So having, in an area that has a lot of construction, having a pre-filter or having a 5 micron is not a bad thing because it doesn't block the filter.
Absolutely.
We can get into that when we talk about technologies.
Yeah, so I mean, as I kind of alluded to, there are a couple of different technologies. The basic one is carbon filtration, and that's what most people know. we're talking 5 micron carbon filtration. Sometimes they go down a little bit smaller into submicron filtration. And, if you've seen a general house filter, you might see a 10 or a 20 micron filtration to kind of be a pre-filter coming into the house. So there's a few of those things out there. So we start with something like this, which is called a Fiberdyne, but it is carbon filtration. It's a new technology of carbon filtration. So it gives you the ability to basically strip most of the stuff out of the water. These come in a 5 micron or a submicron, and it's basically protecting you from that level of sediment, making sure there's nothing floating around in the water, and your water is going to be relatively clean and odor-free going into the coffee machine. This is really good in those places like Sydney, places that have really nice water that's relatively balanced and you don't need to play around too much. Does come with a warning though, with something like this one with the submicron. If you're in places with silica in the water, such as around Victoria, then submicron can be a little bit problematic because the silica actually blocks up those pores in the filtration a lot faster than they would in other areas.
So they'll be better off with a 5 micron.
5 micron, absolutely, The next step is what we call water softening. You might hear of it as ion exchange, and that's where the water itself is coming in with certain type of minerals, and it's turning it into positive minerals for coffee. So it might be adding, in some cases, might be adding magnesium or carbonate hardness. It might be coating the bad minerals with good minerals. And you can basically have water that's a little bit more balanced, a little bit higher carbonate hardness to balance out sometimes those chlorides in the water and have safe water. This is also good for areas where you want to build that carbonate hardness just a little bit more to get more of that flavor.
Normally in a filter like this, you start having on the filter head like a bypass. You have to start measuring the water, working out how far you want to strip it.
Absolutely, And when we start getting into filters like this, it really is a good idea to reach out to people to get your water tested. There are places around that will do the water testing. Generally, a pool shop will do your water testing,
or an aquarium that sells fish.
Absolutely,
they're in every suburb, so
and they'll be able to test your water. And it's a good idea to have a little bit of an educated decision when you're going into this filtration, because they can be a little bit more expensive, and there are some other factors in using a filtration like this that will change the lifespan of a filter. If your water is too hard and it's doing a lot of work, then it's not going to last as long as softer water.
For those that are concerned with that, you can buy flowmeters that count how much water has gone through the filter. So instead of guessing every 6 or 12 months, you know exactly how much water.
Absolutely.
And a bit more scientific approach to when to change the filter rather than an educated guess.
Absolutely.
And the last medium really tends to be RO.
RO. So RO, that is the big shebang of water filter. It's got a membrane that the water passes through, and that's going to strip basically everything up to around about 95 to 98% of what's in the water out of the water. Then what you're doing is you're building on top of that water with carbon hardness or other mineral additives to build it up to somewhere that you want it to be. So RO systems generally can be a little bit more costly, but you do generally have a greater control over the water. And certainly if you're out there targeting flavour and really want to make sure your espresso is the best you possibly can be, an RO system's actually not a bad way to go.
We actually worked back in MICE when the World Barista Comp was on with Everpure to set up the 2 RO systems to get it spot on 100 TDS for every competitor. It was actually the biggest learning curve of seeing the whole competition just running stable water across everywhere. It was a crazy rig that they built.
And it's awesome when you know that the water's the same in a competition setting like that. You know that whatever the competitor's coming with is what they can do with it. There's no changes, no differences in the water. It's all to do with them and their coffee. So it really is a leveler, and it really is a good way to kind of sort out the playing field.
You tend to see also in franchises that they want their coffee to taste the same all across the country.
Absolutely.
So they want the water to be the same because that's one big factor affecting coffee, and people end up liking a particular taste. So it's really important for them to be able to replicate that taste in every state. And we're talking about Australia, but this could be anywhere in the world.
Absolutely, anywhere in the world, you know. And I mean, if you look on a world sort of stage, Australian water compared to other parts of the world is relatively soft. You know, we talk about WA having hard water, but it's not really hard water in comparison to other parts of the world. The funny thing is, in Australia, the biggest thing we're combating is those chlorides in the water, and that's always been a confusion for many of the world's coffee machine manufacturers, because they build their coffee machines generally for a world setting, but Australia threw some pretty nasty curveballs at them in the last 15 years. When it comes to the type of water going through those machines and the technology. Again, as we progressed into stainless steel boilers and stuff like that, then we started to see those failures that we hadn't seen for so many years of coffee making in Australia.
The stainless steel really did change, and that's really become quite common now. So that's when, I mean, most machines that have stainless steel boilers send a test kit when you buy it, because they really want people to start thinking water, and they don't send a water filter with it, because obviously it's different depending where it's going, but they really put, I mean, if you buy Lamazoka, it says you need to test it for the warranty.
Absolutely, yeah. You know, they generally say a certain amount of chlorides, anything over that, then that boiler's not going to be warrantable. And that, obviously is an expensive investment. So you don't want to be playing around with something that's...
But the end result is you get better coffee, and that's, I guess, the icing on the cake.
Absolutely.
I don't know if icing on the cake's the right term, but the end result is
criminal
better
espresso. Definitely. I mean, if you're going to be spending that much money on a coffee machine, and arguably you're probably going to be spending that much money on a grinder, you want to make sure that everything is good. And water filtration is one of those things that can really make sure your water is going to look after the coffee machine and look after the espresso.
So on that note, if you got a question for Paul or for me, hit us up on the comments below. I know water's a bit of a rabbit hole. We can go into many different questions, but feel free to hit us up in the comments and we'll get back to you. And Paul, thank you so much for coming in again.
No worries, thanks for having me.
I'm hoping to do a few more videos with you, because your level of knowledge is insane.
It's fun being here, thank you.
And like always, if this video has brought you value, please hit that thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe. Thank you, and see you on the next video.